Hello! This will be a demonstration of Proposition 21 from Book 8 of Euclid's Elements, which says that if two mean proportionals fall between two numbers, then those two numbers are similar solid numbers. This is much like the previous proposition 820, but instead of one mean proportional, there are two, and instead of similar plane numbers, we will be proving that these are similar solid numbers. Much like the previous proposition, there are two things to note about this enunciation beforehand. First is the two mean proportionals. It is two and only two mean proportionals. This does not work if you have any more than two mean proportionals. And secondly, this is not the first time we've seen this language about similar solid numbers. We saw this in Proposition 819, for example. So I will not be going over how exactly we get that language, what exactly a solid number is, why we call them solid, or why we call them similar solid numbers. You can refer to my previous video, Proposition 819, or you can simply ask me in the comment section down below. Now, with that said, we are given two numbers, A and B, and between them, there are two mean proportionals, C and D, so that A is to C, just as C is to D, just as D is to B. So there are two mean proportionals between the two numbers A and B. What we want to then prove, given this, is that our two numbers A and B are similar solid numbers. We're going to begin this by taking three numbers E, F, and G, which are the least numbers in the same ratio as A, C, and D, or C, D, and B. They're two ways of saying the same ratio. Of course, this is an unnecessary step if A, C, D, and B are already in least terms, but that's such a simple case that Euclid doesn't deal with it. It quite explains itself. So we're only dealing with the case where A, C, D, and B are not in least terms. These are not the least numbers. So E, F, and G are the least numbers which have the same ratio as A, C, and D, and which have the same ratio as C, D, and B. And because they are the least, we can then say by Proposition 8.3, we know that if a continued proportion is in least terms, then the extremes are prime to each other. That's Proposition 8.3. So because E, F, and G is a continued proportion in least terms, the extremes E and G are therefore prime to each other. Furthermore, we also know that because E is to F just as F is to G, that's what it means for E, F, and G to make a continued proportion, that E is to F just as F is to G. We can then use the previous proposition 820 to say that because there is one mean proportion, namely F, which falls between the two numbers E and G, the two numbers E and G are therefore similar plane numbers. Again, that's the previous proposition 820. And because there are similar plane numbers, we can find their proportional sides. And that's what we're going to do in the next step. We're going to take the four numbers H, K, L, and M, such that H and K are the sides or factors of E, and L and M are the sides or factors of G. And furthermore, H is to K just as L is to M. Now, the next step here is a little strange. It's not unprecedented for Euclid to refer to only a part of a previous proposition, but that's exactly what he does here. I'm going to try my best to explain what exactly is going on here. So we know H and K are the sides of E, and L and M are the sides of G. And we also know that E, F, and G form a continued proportion, that F is the mean proportional between E and G. What this allows us to say, using a part of just the previous proposition 820, is that H and L have the same ratio as E and F and G. And furthermore, K and M also have the same ratio as E and F and G. Euclid, again, just to reiterate, Euclid gets this by referring to just a part of the previous proposition, so not the enunciation of proposition 820, but a certain fragment of it. You can refer to that if you'd like to go through all this logic in full, or again, comment section down below is open, so I'd be willing to explain it there. But for right now, we're just going to take it as a fact that H is to L, just as K is to M. They're the same with one another. And furthermore, they're also the same with E to F and F to G. Having said that, we know that E is to F just as A is to C. We made E and F in that way. And furthermore, we also know F is to G just as C is to D. Again, we made F and G that way in our first step, which means we can then say xi quali by proposition 714, going through the mean proportional of F and C to compare the extremes of E and G and A and D respectively. This is proposition 714, that xi quali, E is then to G just as A is to D. But we know that E and G are prime to each other. We proved that in step 2. And we know that prime numbers, or numbers that are prime with one another, it's my bad, co-prime numbers, numbers that are prime with one another, are the least of those in their particular ratio. That's proposition 721. And we know that the least numbers in any ratio measure any other numbers in that same ratio the same number of times, the antecedent, and the consequent. That's proposition 720. So that because E and G are the least numbers in the same ratio as A and D, E therefore measures A the same number of times that G measures D. We can go through a similar set of reasoning to get that E measures C the same number of times that G measures B. This would be done by, instead of using the terms A, C, and D, you would use the terms C, D, and B. You would go through steps 6 and 7 again, but instead of A, C, and D, you're using C, D, and B. But the propositions used will be the exact same. The point is, though, that E measures C the same number of times that G measures D. What we're going to do next is we're going to create two new numbers, N and O, such that there are as many units in N as there are E's in A, or as there are G's in D. Those are two ways of saying the same thing. We just proved that in step 7. So the unit measures N the same number of times that E measures A, which is the same number of times that G measures D. We're going to create O in a similar way, but instead, there are as many units in O as there are E's in C, or as there are G's in B. Again, in step 8, we had proved that those are two ways of saying the same thing. So the unit measures O the same number of times that E measures C, which is the same number of times that G measures B. Now, because the unit measures N the same number of times that E measures A, we can convert this into a statement about multiplication by the definition of multiplication, which is definition 7:15, that because the unit measures N the same number of times that E measures A, that therefore N times E, or the product of N and E, is A. Similarly, we can prove that the product of O and G is B, and the product of O and E is C. This would again be done by taking these statements about measuring the same number of times and turning them into statements about multiplication by definition 7:15. So N times E makes A, O times G makes B, and O times E makes C. Now, because N times E makes A, we have just shown that, and we know that E is the product of H and K. We made H and K in that way in our fourth step. We can then substitute H and K, or the product of H and K, for E, and say also that N times H times K makes A. But A, therefore, is the product of three numbers, which then means it is a solid number. That's just what it means to be a solid number, is that you are the product of, is that a number, I should say, is the product of three numbers. So because A is the product of N, H, and K, it is therefore a solid number. And in a similar way, we can say that the number B is a solid number. It is the product of O, L, and M. Now, you'll notice that the number e has been multiplied by two numbers n and o to make the numbers a and c respectively. We know that e times n makes a and e times o makes c. We have proved that in steps 10 and 11. And we know from proposition 717 that if a number multiplied by two numbers makes two products, the two numbers multiplied have the same ratio as the products. Again, that's proposition 717. So that because e times n and o makes a and c respectively, n is to o just as a is to c. But we know a is to c just as e is to f. We made e and f in that way in our first step. So we have two ratios which are the same with the same ratio, property of numbers. They're the same with one another, so that n is to o just as e is to f. But we also know from step 5 that e is to f just as h is to l, just as k is to m. So again, we have ratios which are the same with the same ratio, property of numbers. They are the same with one another, so that n is to o also just as h is to l, just as k is to m. Which then means that the product of n, h, and k is similar to the product of o, l, and m. This follows simply from the definition of similar solid numbers. That's definition 721. So that because n is to o, just as h is to l, just as k is to m, we can then say that the product of n, h, and l is similar to the product of o, l, and m. But we know that the product of n, h, and l, the product of n, h, and l is the number a. We had shown that in step 12. And we know that the product of o, l, and m is the number b. We had shown that in step 13. So that the solid number a and the solid number b, they are similar to one another. A and b are therefore similar solid numbers. And this is precisely what we set out to prove, which means we are done with the proposition, therefore, etc. Q, E, D. I'd like to give an example with particular numbers just to help elucidate what exactly this proposition is saying. So say we have the two numbers 12 and 96. There are two mean proportionals we can fit between these two. We can go 12 is to 24, just as 24 is to 48, just as 48 is to 96. These are all just 1/2 ratios. 12 is half of 24, 24 is half of 48, and 48 is half of 96. So because this is true, that between 12 and 96, there are two mean proportionals, then 12 and 96, this proposition tells us, are similar solid numbers. What that's going to look like is that we can represent these as actual solids, as geometric solids that are similar to one another. That is, that their sides are proportional and they are equiangular. So let's do that real fast. If we were to represent 12 as a solid, we could do this by making a rectangular prism with dimensions or sides of 2, 2, and 3. Let's do that, like that. So that would be 2, 2, and 3. So the volume of this whole solid is 12. We can do a similar thing with 96 and do this as 4, 4, and 6. We just double all the lengths. That will look something like this. It'll show up just fine, but even if it doesn't, you can use your imagination. The point is that if we represent these two numbers as solids, we can get their sides to be proportional. So that would be 4, that would be 4, this would be 6, the whole area would be, or volume would be 96. And you'll notice that these two solids are proportional because 2 is to 2, just as 4 is to 4, and 2 is to 3, just as 4 is to 6. Their sides are proportional, and furthermore, they're obviously equiangular. So these two solids are similar. But we also made these solids to represent the numbers 12 and 96. We know 12 and 96 are solid numbers. And because their solids are similar, we can then say that they are similar solid numbers. Again, I explain more where this language comes from in proposition 819, so you could of course refer back to that video for a fuller explanation of where exactly I'm getting this from. But the point is that 12 and 96 are similar solid numbers, and we know this because there are two mean proportionals that fit between them. That is what this proposition 821 proves to us. One last thing, there is a similar precaution that you must take with this proposition that I advised in the previous video about 820. Not every solid you can make of 12 and 96 will be similar. The obvious example is if you have a solid with sides of 1, 1, and 12, and another solid of sides 1, 1, and 96. They'll obviously have the volumes of 12 and 96 respectively, but it's not hard to imagine that those won't be similar solids. This proposition is not guaranteeing that any combination of sides, or as we would say, factors of 12 and 96 will be proportional. All it's saying is that there is some combination of sides or factors of 12 and 96 that you can arrange proportionally to get similar solids. And again, the reason we know this is because there are two mean proportionals that fit between 12 and 96. That's all I've got to say about this proposition, so I'll end the video here and move on to proposition 822.